Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about like Canada's role in all this because I know this is what you've been researching. Um,
Yeah.
I'm sort of interested in the history of the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada because Canada has actually like the third largest Ukrainian population after Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, like, you know, so I'm just gonna. That's better. Um, in the late 1890s, you had these twin forces. You essentially had the Austro-Hungarian part of Ukraine, like Bukovina and sort of the West, was undergoing like famine, uh, horrible labor conditions, obviously, um, and Canada had an emergent West, fertile West, not dissimilar to the Great Ukrainian Steppe, and we needed settlers. We needed people. Our prime minister at the time said, "We need stalwart peasants in sheepskin coats to work the land," and that was the first wave of Ukrainians. They did not have an easy time. Like often, I was actually kind of shocked when I was reading about this history, but often there was like a kind of similar situation with um, trafficked labor, like where that we have today and have had for the last like yeah forever. But essentially, you had people going to Ukraine and promising the moon to Ukrainian peasants, saying, you get to Canada, you get a chunk of land, it's amazing, you can grow anything. And these Ukrainians would come over and they'd be in like fucking Saskatchewan, which is fine in the summer, but then it's minus 40 Celsius in the winter. They're not getting what they were promised. Often the labor was harder than the labor they were doing at home, but they made it work. So that was kind of the first wave. And then there was another wave after the Russian Revolution, and then just successive waves. And what sort of accreted was a Ukrainian working community, mostly agricultural workers, and then eventually some Ukrainian diaspora who worked in factories, but laborers, right? Like these are migrant laborers who are forming communities in this new country, and they're preserving their culture through things like workers' benevolent temples or halls, and a lot of those places became extremely politicized as the century moved towards the 1930s, and sort of labor consciousness popped up. And one of the tragedies, I think, of the Ukrainian diaspora is that before being infiltrated by Bandera worshipping psychos who used to, work for the Nazis, they, the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada, were doing things like setting up healthcare, going on strike, organizing labor, and doing it in a way that you didn't necessarily have to be Ukrainian to participate in these things. Their organizing quickly, like, sort of transcended their own diaspora, which I think is sort of rare. I don't see many
Mm-hmm.
cases of that in
Mm-hmm.
Canada, right?
Yeah,
Like,
and you mentioned this before we started recording, but they weren't the reason they weren't the only reason why Canada has nationalized healthcare now, but they were one of the first organizations to provide free healthcare, right? Mm-hmm.
yeah, yeah. Well, they had these things called Workers' Benevolent Associations, which started, I believe, in Manitoba and then moved west and east from there. Yeah, and they had the AUUC, which was Ukrainian diaspora organization that was heavily left and eventually absolutely crushed by in the late 1940s, early 1950s by imported fascists.
Yeah, and then so they imported all of these like right wing Ukrainians to sort of counterbalance. I don't know. I guess like this left wing sort of tendency within that
Yeah,
Ukrainian diaspora.
Yeah, and when we're saying right wing, like I want to be clear that the ones who did the real damage and would eventually form the leadership of the diaspora were almost to a man Nazi collaborators. Like we imported thousands of demobilized Waffen SS
Mm-hmm.
14th Division uh, and injected them
Mm-hmm.
into the diaspora. Um, our finance minister's grandfather being one of these people, right? Like the 14th Galician Division was basically the Nazis' attempt to create a centralized military unit in Ukraine made up of Ukrainian nationalists who would they could point them at whoever whoever they wanted to erase from the map, and they'd do it, you know. And also cannon fodder when the
Mm-hmm.
Red Army showed up. So
And so this is the
yeah,
reason why they have like such a large influence in Canadian politics right now.
yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting that the way that this happened is kind of fascinating. There was this British colonial officer named Tracy Phillips who had been posted in Ukraine during the 1930s and 40s, and was brought into Canada ostensibly. So Phillips not only was a colonial officer, but was also working for
Mm-hmm.
British military intelligence as well, like a very classic, like kind of you know, maybe a generation before like a Jean le Carré guy, you know. He'd worked in Central Africa, administrating colonial holdings, with all of that entails, right? Like, um, and he was contracted to come in and do a survey. He did a train tour of Western Canada to do a survey of the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada and find out what their political leanings were. It was sold to the people attending it as like oh, you go to listen to this British man talk about your homeland, you know. But really, what they were doing was they were collecting information, and he and a Ukrainian man named Vladimir K, who was a hardline Ukrainian nationalist who was living in Canada at the time, essentially came up with the idea that, you know, this is my theory at least, but to cool the leftism in the Ukrainian population, they had to import a counterweight. Kay was the head of the citizen branch advising on Eastern European immigration in Canada until 1962. So he would have been the person that consulted when they were like, hey, we've got all these demobilized Nazis in an Italian displaced persons camp. Should we let them in? Or should we, you know, leave them there or send them to Russia where they will go to the gulag? And he and Phillips, and also the current prime minister at the time, Mackenzie King, who was a big fan of Hitler, that guy. So that was that. You know, they imported these people, and you can see the change in the diaspora almost immediately. Like they formed Kay and Phillips. Kay specifically helped form the UCC, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, as sort of a new umbrella that would encompass all, was supposedly going to encompass all political leanings of the diaspora, the people who loved going to church, the people who loved going to Toronto and waving around
Mm-hmm.
Stalin and Lenin banners, you know, the
Yeah,
workers,
talk
all of
about
them.
the
Yeah.
Ukrainian Canadian Congress because this is an organization that I see a lot whenever I read, articles about Canadian policy vis-a-vis Ukraine. Um, are they? Is it kind of like the World Uyghur Congress, like in the United States, that's comprised of like these reactionary diaspora people, and they like push for these like these very hawkish policies toward yeah.
Yeah, yes. I mean, you could imagine it like that, except for it has the like quote unquote legitimacy of being now a total fixture. You know, I think it's like the UCC essentially claims to speak for all Ukrainian Canadians. They have captured the front face, the public face of the diaspora. which I know, like, for people, like, I have a friend, Alex Boykovich, who is the person who uncovered, at least publicly uncovered, the link between Chrystia Freeland's grandfather and his job at the Nazi newspaper. For people like Alex, the existence of the UCC is extremely problematic, and I think for other Ukrainians, that's the only thing they've ever known. Because it's incredibly hard to find history on left Ukrainian organizing. The UCC and people like Freeland and her uncle and her grandfather and her mother did a great job of rewriting the history of Ukrainians in Canada.
Do you know who the UCC is funded by?
It's funded by the Canadian government. It gets a lot of money from the Canadian government. I think there are private donors as well. The UCC has been involved in, not just domestically, but has been involved in some pretty major projects. They were very entwined with the Anti-Bolshevik League of Nations back in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and then they were a big backer of this fake holiday that we have here called Black Ribbon Day, which essentially promotes the idea of a double genocide. It's a form of Holocaust revisionism, right? I mean, you know this story, I'm sure, but Canada had a huge hand in sort of mainstreaming that idea that there were equal massacres on both sides, but the quiet thing is that Stalin was worse, right? Like,